Hey everybody, Matt here. In today's video, I'm going to compare a bandsaw to a scroll saw to the Blade Runner. The Blade Runner uses a two-pronged power cord. It is polarized. The scroll saw and the bandsaw both use three-prong power cords, so they're grounded. So all three saws take standard 115, 120 volt AC household power. Now let's compare how much noise each machine makes when it's running. We'll start with the Blade Runner. Scroll saw. And finally the bandsaw. I think it's pretty clear that the Blade Runner is the noisiest. Now let's compare the tabletops. I think you can see that the Blade Runner has the largest tabletop. However, the Blade Runner tabletop doesn't tilt. It's in a fixed position, which means that the table is always 90 degrees to the blade. The scroll saw, on the other hand, has a table that can tilt to the left. And likewise, the bandsaw also has a table that can tilt. So now let's talk about price. I think these saws are all right around $100, plus or minus maybe $20, $25. I'll look up what the current prices are and post those in the video description. Now let's talk about portability. The Blade Runner is very light. It's made mostly of plastic and actually has a handle built right into the tabletop. The scroll saw, on the other hand, is about the same weight. It doesn't have a handle, but you can pick it up right from the arm of the scroll saw. The bandsaw is the heaviest of the three. There is no handle, but it's not that bad to move around. The scroll saw is the only saw of these three that has a variable speed motor. That's the slowest speed. That's the fastest speed. The Blade Runner and the bandsaw both run at just one single fixed speed. Now let's talk about the on-off switch locking key. The Blade Runner has a key that's built into the power switch. You take the key out and you're not able to turn the Blade Runner on. Put the key back in, then you can turn the Blade Runner back on. The scroll saw doesn't have any sort of locking key like that. As long as the scroll saw is plugged in, when somebody turns on the switch, it's going to start moving. The bandsaw does have a power lock key. You take that out, it's not possible to turn on the bandsaw. Put that back in, then you're able to turn on the bandsaw. Now let's talk about dust collection. The Blade Runner has a hose adapter that fits onto the arm so you can plug in a shop vac. The scroll saw has a dust collecting port down here, and the bandsaw has a larger dust collecting port down here. So all three machines have a way to collect the dust. Now let's talk about accessories. The Blade Runner comes with an adjustable miter gauge, but it is kind of a sloppy fit in the track. It also comes with an adjustable fence, but it also is kind of a sloppy fit, so you really need to set it up and make sure that you're in the right position before you use it. The scroll saw has no ability to take any accessories like that. The bandsaw comes with a miter gauge, also adjustable, and just like the miter gauge on the Blade Runner, the fit is kind of sloppy. Rockwell offers an additional accessory for the Blade Runner. This is this Crosscut Sled. It is for an extra charge. It is made totally out of plastic. It's fairly light, but I have used this and have found it to be rather useful. The scroll saw doesn't have any capacity to take a miter gauge or a crosscut sled. The bandsaw comes with a miter gauge. If you wanted a crosscut sled for your bandsaw, you'd probably have to make your own. Now let's talk about blades. The BladeRunner uses standard T-shank type jigsaw blades. In my area, there's a couple of big local big box home improvement type stores where I can very quickly go and buy T-shank blades. You can get blades that will cut wood, metal, aluminum, plastic. There's even blades you can get that will cut ceramic. So there's lots of different materials that the BladeRunner can cut. So far I've primarily cut wood, but I have cut aluminum and mild steel with this BladeRunner with, of course, the appropriate blade. The scroll saw uses pinned end blades, pin end blades. There are a couple of places locally where I can get these kinds of blades for this scroll saw. They're a specific length. I believe these blades are 5 inches. If I needed anything that wasn't available locally, I'd have to order it online and probably from someplace like Amazon. The bandsaw uses a blade that's a very specific length. It's one big loop. The blade that I've got in the saw right now happens to be the blade that came with the saw, and it's still plenty sharp, so I haven't had to change it yet. However, there aren't any stores around me where I can get the right length bandsaw blade that will fit in this saw. So I'm going to have to order blades online, again, probably from Amazon. Now let's talk about changing blades. The BladeRunner has a very easy and quick mechanism to change the blades. I literally just push this red button in and move it to the left. The blade literally pops out. Insert a new blade and you're ready to go. The scroll saw, on the other hand, you have to release the tension on the blade, remove the blade, reinstall a new blade, and then reestablish the tension on the blade. Same goes for the bandsaw. In order to change the blade, you have to release the tension, change the blade, and then reestablish the tension. This particular bandsaw has a quick tension release lever, which is pretty handy, makes it a little bit quicker and easier to change the blade. The scroll saw, tension is handled by this knob, so you literally have to unscrew the knob to loosen the tension. And like I said, the BladeRunner, all you have to do is push that button and the blade comes right out. So the blade in the BladeRunner is held on one end only, this end. Now if you're using the BladeRunner with the arm, there are a couple of bearings in here that the blade runs up and down in between. So there is some side-to-side support for the blade when it's cutting, but there's still the possibility of the blade bending or twisting as you're making your cuts. The scroll saw, on the other hand, the blade is held very tightly on each end, and in fact the blade is stretched and is held in tension. So the blade still can bend and twist as you're cutting, but it is more firmly held than the BladeRunner's blade. The blade in the bandsaw is held in tension, just like the blade on the scroll saw. You can adjust the tension just like you can on the scroll saw. And the blade is fairly well supported. There are a couple of guides up top and there's a couple of guides underneath the table to try and keep the blade from moving around too much as you're making your cut. But as you can see, the blade can move. So with all three of these saws, the whole idea is to let the blade do the work. Don't rush the cut. Now let's talk about safety. Now, of course, everybody is responsible for their own safety. So if you are doing something with a power tool or even a hand tool and you're uncomfortable doing it, by all means don't do it. We don't want to see anybody get hurt. On the other hand, I think all three of these saws are relatively safe to use for beginning woodworkers or even crafters. They certainly are a lot safer than, say, a table saw, where the blade on a table saw spins very, very quickly and there's the potential for kickback. None of these saws exhibit that potential, at least as far as I've seen. So I would say if you're looking for a relatively safe saw to get started with, one of these three saws, depending on the kinds of cuts you need to make, might be a really good choice for you. Another difference between these three saws that I think is worth mentioning is in the blades themselves. The BladeRunner, as said earlier, uses a standard T-shank blade, and it's just this long. The scroll saw uses a blade, this particular saw uses a 5-inch blade, but the actual stroke of the saw is a little over an inch, I believe. So it's just 1 inch or so of the blade that's actually doing the cut. And the same thing with the BladeRunner. The bandsaw, on the other hand, the blade for the bandsaw is one continuous loop that goes this way. So when it cuts a piece of wood right here, that portion of the blade has to circle all the way around the loop before it has a chance to make another cut using that same section of the blade. Consequently, I believe the blades on a bandsaw will last a lot longer because there's more of a blade. The blades on the scroll saw, they will either get dull or frankly they'll break. And if you break them, it's generally because you're trying to take too tight of a corner, or you've twisted the blade and somehow stressed it, and then it'll snap on you. The BladeRunner blades, they don't break. I've never had one break. They will get dull though. So if you've got a lot of cutting to make, you might want to have a whole bunch of blades ready to go when you start your project. Another thing to keep in mind is the BladeRunner really excels at cutting thinner materials. I'll say 3/4 of an inch and thinner. The scroll saw, same thing. You can cut thicker materials on both of these saws, but they do tend to labor and it takes a long time to cut, say, a 2-inch piece of material. The bandsaw, on the other hand, has no trouble cutting through thicker wood. So which saw is best or most appropriate for you really depends on what kind of cuts you're going to make, as I've said before. I think for beginning woodworkers and even crafters, you're probably making cuts on thinner material. So in that case, either the BladeRunner or the scroll saw would work just fine. And as I've said before, if I could only choose one saw between the three, it would be the BladeRunner. So if you're like me, you've probably watched a bunch of other woodworking type videos on YouTube. I've watched a whole bunch and subscribed to a whole bunch of those channels. And one of the things that I found in common with some of the better woodworkers is they tend to draw a line, or better yet, use a marking knife to indicate where they want to make their cut on their piece of wood. And then they cut with whatever saw they're going to use reasonably close to the line, but not on the line. And then they sand the rest of the wood until they get right up to their marked line, either with a pencil or a marking knife. So if that's the way you're going to pursue woodworking, then I ask you, does it really matter which one of these three saws you use to make the rough cut if you're going to sand to the line anyway? So you might be watching this video and thinking to yourself, well, it's great that Matt has all three of these saws, but I can only afford to buy one saw. So which saw should I buy? Well, if I was faced with that question, knowing what I know now, I probably would not choose the scroll saw just because I feel it's a little bit more limiting in what you can do with it compared to the bandsaw or the BladeRunner. But that could be in part because my skill level with the scroll saw is not all that great right now. So maybe if I got better with the saw, I would change my opinion. But as of today, I would say the scroll saw is not my first saw. Now it's between the bandsaw and the BladeRunner. It's a tough call because I really enjoy using the bandsaw. However, I think if I could only buy one of these three saws, I would buy the BladeRunner. And there's a few reasons for that. First of all, the BladeRunner can make inside and outside cuts. The scroll saw can, but the bandsaw cannot. The BladeRunner does come with a fence and a miter gauge, which of course the scroll saw does not. The bandsaw comes with a miter gauge, but you'd have to make your own fence if you wanted to set something up like that. The BladeRunner uses T-shank blades, which are commonly available at the big box stores. And there are all kinds of different blades to cut different kinds of material. So if you are a craftsperson or a hobbyist and you want the freedom and the flexibility to try cutting lots of different kinds of materials, then maybe the BladeRunner would be the best choice. The other thing that I really like about the BladeRunner is that it is very portable. There are some other things I really like about the BladeRunner, but I won't elaborate on all those in this video. I've made 3 other videos about the BladeRunner, and you can learn more about my experience with the BladeRunner by watching those. So if I had to choose one of these 3 saws, I would probably go with the BladeRunner. As it turns out, the BladeRunner is the first of these 3 saws that I actually got. I got this as a birthday gift from my wife back in 2017. I tried using the saw, really liked it, made some videos about it, and then a few months later I had an opportunity to buy this scroll saw used from a gentleman who was moving and couldn't take it with him. So he made me such a great deal I couldn't pass up the opportunity to buy this saw, and I'm very glad that I did. And then a few months after that I had a chance to buy this bandsaw new with a substantial discount using an online coupon from Harbor Freight. And so I jumped at the chance. I've never owned and used a bandsaw before. This is the first one I've actually used, and I really like using the saw. So as it turned out, I got this one first, this one second, and that one third. I'm glad I have all 3. Well, I hope this comparison video was useful for you. Check the description in this video for links to the individual videos I did for each 3 of these saws, where you'll get more detail about the features and benefits.